I don't know how long you've been around, but, oh yeah, that's actually a long time now that I think of it. But anyway, grabbing onto my leg.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to call the school committee meeting to order on September 1st at 7 p.m. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Tonight we have two student representatives, Ariana Acosta and Elena Chang. You can come up and speak, please.
Is this thing on? Yeah. Okay, sorry. Good evening. My name is Adriana Acosta, and I'm an 8th grade student at Douglas Middle School. This year, we're starting classes. We're getting ready to start real learning in, I think, like a day or something, because we're getting the paperwork and all the introductions ready. And this year, the students are participating in cross-country volleyball at the high school and field hockey at Blackstone Millville Regional, I think is what it's called. When we entered in, the schools were really nice and clean, and everything was ready to start learning. This year, we are doing electives, so that's exciting. I'm screwing this up. So electives have been really fun and have been a really nice addition to this school year. We're looking forward to a great year.
Hi, my name is Alana Chang, and I'm a new student at Douglas Middle School who moved here from Plainville. Students and teachers have been very welcoming here and really friendly. And also, Mr. O'Brien is planning on making more clubs and stuff like that, which I think will be really nice so people can interact with each other and make new friends. Also, lunch is really good here, and I'm glad that I'm here at Douglas Middle School. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Is Adriana, you were here last year? Do you like the new schedule? Yeah? If you feel like it's an improvement? Okay. Okay. Great, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming.
You don't have to stay. You don't want to stay.
Thank you both for coming in. So this is the public comment and communications. So do we have anybody? Are we doing the YouTube? Is there anybody?
Hold on, yeah. I'll check.
Thank you.
Nothing.
Thank you so much. Moving on to old business. Do we have anything to discuss?
We do not?
Going into the new business and the superintendent's report.
All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. It's been a great 3 days here already to start. Monday was our first day of school with convocation for the teachers. Started the morning with teachers in their buildings, meeting as individual buildings, getting in their classrooms and doing some work to get ready for students on Tuesday. We met here in the high school as a faculty together for convocation. It was great to have everyone for the first time in 2 years under the same roof. We spent some time celebrating staff and longevity here in Douglas. It was something that Kevin Maines started a few years ago, and I continued. And what was great about looking at the longevity list is we recognize people who were here in 5-year chunks, 10 years, 15, 20, 25, 30 years. And what I loved about looking at the list of staff names is it wasn't just teachers, it was teachers, paraprofessionals, cafeteria workers, custodians. We had 5 people who've been here for over 30 years. 3 of them were teachers, 1 was a cafeteria worker, and 1 was an ABA. So it was just awesome to see that how much people love being here and stay here. Our keynote speaker was Aaron Polanski. Aaron talked a lot about the importance of building relationships, making connections with kids, and doing the little things. And when you do those little things, it makes things a lot better in a school. He talked about his acronym, Are You Okay? And how important it is just to ask people if they are okay, and how that can change the course of someone's life. I'm going to give kudos to Mr. O'Brien and Mr. Aronian. Yesterday, we had a bunch of kids for a variety of reasons who weren't here the first day of school. So Bob went out, Matt dressed up in the tiger outfit, and they went to families' homes on the first day of school and delivered their work and delivered their opening day packets to make kids feel included because they couldn't be here the first day of school. So taking that message from Aaron about doing the little things, making connections, parents cried, you said, in a good way. Parents cried, kids were thrilled. So I think that's a sign of the year we're going to have when we start off that year. So thank you to Mr. O'Brien and Mr. Aronian for doing that for our kids and embracing that message from Aaron about doing the little things and making connections, which is just awesome. Last week, I said thank you to the staff for getting us ready for the first day. Thank you to our kids. They've been fantastic these first few days. You can see the smiles in their eyes. You don't think you can see smiles in kids' eyes, but you can actually see the smiles in their eyes, and families have been great. Do we have a few little kinks to work out? Of course we do. Morning drop-off, pick-up, a couple little things here and there. We met today as a leadership team, and we're working on them. We should have them ironed out in the next couple of days, but we're working on those little things. But for most part, it's been a very, very, very smooth opening these first 2 days of school. Principals, I've asked them to set up Zoom meetings with families next week and the week after, just to fill them in on what's going on inside their buildings, the safety protocols we have in place, and to be able to connect with families the first 2 weeks of school to answer questions and give some feedback to what's going on. On the 15th, we'll have principals here to give a 2-week update as to how the school year has started in each of the buildings. Thought day 2 might be a little tough with not a lot of information, but they'll be here in 2 weeks to give an update. The other thing I've asked them to do is we're going to ask all new teachers in the district to come here on the 15th so they can be introduced formally to the committee and to the community. So each of the principals will be introducing their new staff on the 15th. There was a conference call today at 1 o'clock to talk a lot about the testing protocols. If you remember last week, I mentioned the test and stay, the BINEX testing, and the rapid testing, that we were accepted into that program. There was a 1 o'clock webinar today on it. I had a 12:30 that ran a little bit late. By the time I got to the room at 1 o'clock, the room was full. So our nurses were on there, and we have a meeting tomorrow at 9 o'clock. I should be sending out information to the community probably next week once I'm able to meet with the nurses on the test and stay, the BINEX testing, and the pool testing program. So all in all, it's been a fantastic start to the school year. We're 3 days for teachers, 2 days for kids. We have 1 day to go tomorrow, so I've been very, very pleased. And like I said, I think if what Bob and Matt did yesterday is indicative of what the school year is going to look like for us. So it's been great. Happy to answer any questions if people have them.
Who was the longest teacher or staff member here? Like, do they have a name, or we don't want to name names?
Oh, we have names. Now you can test my memory. So it was Kathy Gauthier was one, Charlene Luco, Linda Hawkinson.
Yeah, just go ahead.
I'm hoping you remember.
I didn't have it here.
I know, and I'm trying to
I was
think
just
of,
curious.
I'm trying to think
It
of
was
her name.
Kathy Gauthier.
Oh, Carol.
Oh, I do.
Oh, my
Okay, who else was it?
Hold on.
It wasn't Carol Manning.
You got Kathy Gauthier, Kathy Jost.
Kathy Jost?
Oh, wow.
Is Danielle Lippert still?
No, Danielle was 25.
And after that, it gets into, for teaching staff, it gets into like Algernon, Cornpole.
He was 25.
Leonard, who were in the 25s, yeah.
I remember 3 of the names, but there were five of them. It's pretty awesome, though.
Nice, yeah, great.
And they still look so young, too. Crazy.
So thank you.
Can I ask, do we have a timeline on when we're going to talk about MCAS scores? We have an
So
estimate.
MCAS preliminary data has come out.
Yeah.
Principals share that. I think we're going to do either the 15th or the 1st meeting. So they have their raw scores.
Yep.
We're still waiting for them to be able to completely finish assessing the scores. But either on the 15th or on the first meeting of October, we'll do that, and we'll do that along with our AP numbers too.
Okay.
And again, it was tough looking at some of the MCAS scores because they don't want to use it to compare schools. They're just using it for
Right.
schools to get some information
Yep.
to start creating,
Yep.
to start mitigating those gaps,
Yep.
and to where kids have strengths and where kids need some improvement. Next week, in 2 weeks, we're going to be coming to you with a proposal to put in vertical teams. We've had vertical teams in various formats over the past couple of years, but one thing we're looking to do is have teachers in each of the grade levels, in each of the different disciplines, meet once a month after school to have those conversations. So a fourth grade ELA teacher could talk to a third grade ELA teacher, who could talk to a fifth grade ELA teacher to see, okay, what did you do, what didn't you do, what did you cover, what didn't you cover? So we're looking to create a formal mechanism for that to occur. Also looking at MCAS data. We spent some time this summer already talking about common planning time in PLCs where principals with staff will be dissecting and looking at that data to create a roadmap for how we can mitigate those gaps. As part of our ESSER 2 grant, we've also increased tutoring options for kids in school to be able to work with that at-risk population to, again, help mitigate gaps. So we have lots of things in place. We just want to spend some time looking at that MCAS data and then establishing a plan.
I imagine for things like the tutoring, that's going to be based on like teacher referrals.
So each of the buildings do it differently. They use end-of-the-year benchmark data. They're using beginning-of-the-year benchmark data. They're using the MCAS scores that we've started looking at. They're looking at teacher input, so it's a variety of factors that are going into it.
Yeah. Okay, so do you mind if I give you my 2 cents?
Sure.
That if we're gonna do, like the building reports from the principals at the next meeting, I don't know if Josh wants to weigh in on this too. I feel like it might be nice to like push out the report on MCAS and
Until the first week.
learning gaps so that, you know, A, they're not so overloaded and kind of focus on what's going on in the building, and B, give a chance for teachers to actually like sort of glean
Yeah.
what's going on. Because I know the MCAS scores can probably be broken down into smaller pieces.
Yeah.
I think personally, my concern is like, what does each grade look like from top to bottom, and what are those gaps based on the kids who are doing remote learning, who weren't able to get on the Zooms as often. So, and like, what's our plan going forward with that sort of thing? That's
That makes
my
sense.
thought.
I agree.
Will that give teachers like an opportunity to kind of share some information, like in terms of like where their children are at and what they're doing at like the parent-teacher conferences?
Right.
I know we
They're
have
in
op-
November?
I know we have open house coming up, which is just to come in and do the building. By November, teachers should be able to give you a pretty clear-cut assessment of where your child is. We, the middle school through grade, and the elementary school through grade 5 use NWEA. We've been doing that for 3-4 years. That's a pretty good assessment tool to get some benchmark data. And we just did a training with our elementary and primary school teachers on Renaissance Star, which is another benchmark assessment that goes through ELA and math for teachers to be able to give that assessment to kids as another measure to see where the gaps are. So within the next month, we're going to have a lot of information,
Yeah, that's good.
which is awesome.
I think if we can have more than the MCAS too, just what teachers are seeing in the classrooms, and some, I don't want to make more work for them, but if, you know, we can just get some kind of feedback about, because MCAS is in the spring, so now we've had the summer. I can speak for my own kids that they didn't do a lot of hitting the books this summer, so.
And I know that last year when we gave the MCAS in May, where kids'
Yeah.
heads were, and when they knew it didn't count,
Right.
there's a different mindset going into it,
Yeah.
but,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not looking for a study, just some like very basic organic feedback about how's it going?
absolutely. Anything else?
Well, I would just say, you know, just along those lines too, is, you know, just kind of giving enough time for us to know, you know, where our child's at and what we need to do to get them to where they need to be by the end of the year too, I think is important. Because, you know, if they're, you know, we've identified gaps and we're hoping beyond this, you know, this year we can catch up. So I think the more time, the better we have to.
And it'll be interesting to see what the state does with MCAS this year, whether they just give it and use it as, not for accountability, but just as feedback for schools. I know a lot of superintendents have already started we started last year that we need to have this year of normal learning in order to fix gaps and get kids caught up. We have a lot of kids who are walking in. You remember from last year, we probably only had about 85% of our kids come back to full person learning when we came back in the spring. So we had 15% of our kiddos still in remote learning. Those are kids who are walking into the building after being away from us for 18 months. There's a curve there to get them caught back up. So we'll see what happens with MCAS. Again, I'm hoping it's not used for accountability, but just as another tool for schools to be able to collect data to help kids.
And do we still, I know last year we were like really robust with the social emotional learning piece and sort of checking in with kids in the morning. Are we still?
We're still doing that. So K to 5 is doing morning meeting still.
Yep.
So that carpet time where they're doing morning meeting. I was just going to point to Josh. Josh, who's not there. Josh is continuing with his advisory. I think it's once a cycle where we'll do that. Then Bob is doing homeroom every day where there's an SEL component as part of it. So we're continuing with that. The ESSA money requires us to use a lot of those funds towards SEL, so that's still going to be an important common thread spread out. Teachers at the elementary school really like that morning meeting piece of it, so we're going to continue with that. And then Josh has done a great job with the advisory piece, him and Desi. Bob's we're now in the process of revamping his, with a new schedule change, getting that SEL piece into homeroom and not making it just attendance and checking off boxes, but actually doing a formalized curriculum as part of it.
Okay, great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I would just echo the social emotional. I think it's going to be a huge component this year for everybody as we get kids back in school and everything else. And so being acutely aware of where the kids are, I think is that's really where we should be focusing on, walking them back, getting them back into the normal rhythm, but understand some of these kids have not been in front of their peers, had to have that interaction. That's a huge component.
Huge.
So whatever we can do to try to soothe that transition, I think we all support that. So
Absolutely.
thank you all.
Thank you.
I think we're good. You're good. So now we're going to call, the school committee is going to call our representative, Tracy Novick, from MASC. She's our representative for us to talk us through a superintendent's evaluation. So thank you so much for coming to us tonight.
It's good to see you all, in person no less, right? It's been all those Zoom calls looking for a superintendent.
Yes.
It's good to see you all together and working together, so that's fantastic. Yeah, and I also always, as I was saying earlier, I always appreciate getting these phone calls in August and September rather than getting them in like May and June when people are sort of panicking and going, oh wait, we have to evaluate the superintendent. How do we do that? Because one of the things that's actually really important, of course, the projector is actually behind you, so I don't know if that is going to throw you all off, is that this is a year-long cycle. So you all already know this, but I always try to make sure that I stress it. Remember, you do have a field director. That you belong to the association for a reason. Call us if you've got questions, if you are puzzled by things, if there are things you need to know, process, anything else. This is actually why MASC exists. It exists for the school committees. It's why we have field directors. That's why we're here. So please make sure that you use us. As I said, the reason that I'm glad to be having this conversation with you now, rather than having it in the spring, is that the evaluation process actually starts with the goals. It doesn't end with the goals. And so the thing to keep in mind from the committee perspective and then from the superintendent perspective is that it's really the goals of the superintendent of the district that underlie everything else that happens in the district in terms of evaluation and goals. So what should be happening is there should be a direct relationship first from the superintendent's goals, and if there are district goals or committee goals, up into the administration goals of the principals and so forth, into the teachers' goals in the classroom, and then ultimately, of course, into the work that's actually happening in the classroom with the students. So these things all should align. They should all be flowing together in the same direction. And that's actually part of That's really what the vision is behind the statewide evaluation system. That if it's being implemented appropriately, if we're actually all if our gears are actually meshing in the way that they're supposed to, and they're all cycling as they should, there really should be this interrelationship such that what you're doing here actually does have a direct relationship to the classroom, even as it's being passed through these various levels. So that, I think, is always an important thing for the committee to keep in mind as you're doing your work with the superintendent around the superintendent's evaluation. This was a big change when it came through as part of the acts of 2011. Previous to 2011, there was not a statewide standard system in terms of evaluation, and in particular, there was not a statewide standard system. Even as it's being passed. Nobody needs to hear me more than once. There wasn't, in particular, a statewide system of superintendent evaluation. So anyone who was on a committee prior to 2011 and then after 2011, I know I was on Worcester at that point, and we got these binders that were like this thick, and there's really nothing that makes a school committee more excited than walking into a meeting and having one of those handed to you and saying that you need to figure out how this works. You will see, I will mention that there's actually been a bit of an update, which in part is designed to bring the superintendent evaluation in particular more in line with what the committee actually sees. Because of course, your relationship with the superintendent is not parallel all that much to the relationship, say, that the principal has with the teacher, where the actual day-to-day work of the teacher is part of what is being observed. Most of what you actually see of the superintendent is, in fact, the work that the superintendent effectively brings to you through the committee meetings. And so there's been an attempt over the past year or so, not this year, year before, 2 years, that to bring the superintendent evaluation more into line with things that you would actually see evidence of. And also to keep the school committee within its own purview when it's evaluating the superintendent. It is, I think, really important to remember, both from the committee's perspective and then also just really from a larger Massachusetts educational perspective. The intent of the evaluation system is actually to measure success and to create improvement. The idea here is not to ding people. It's also not to, praise them to the skies. It's to actually help people get better. And that's what I always think is really important for the school committee to remember as they're doing their job. Certainly you want to recognize success. You also want to figure out where there are places that could be improved and be part of the constructive process of making that happen. And because this was part of a 2011 act, and then subsequent regulation, which we know the department is so good at, there are requirements in terms of how this works. So, and it's something that has to be implemented by everyone. So it does, I think, from a school committee perspective, require greater attention to the evaluation process, in part because, as we're saying here, it is a year-round cycle. So it's not something where you can sort of get to a meeting in June and go, oh, we got to evaluate the superintendent. That's not the way it's supposed to work. I'm not going to say that everyone does it right, but it's not the way it's supposed to work. There are still, I think, committees that are becoming accustomed to how this works. We've had it for about 10 years now, but I think that some people are not necessarily putting all of it in. In most cases, we're still requiring annual evaluations. There are some committees with more experienced superintendents who've been in their roles for longer that have chosen to go to an every other year cycle. That is an option for longer serving superintendents. There is, however, some flexibility within the standard tool, which is part of what we're going to talk about. So there are 3 key components to the evaluation system. There is this 5-step cycle, which again, as I said, is why I'm relieved that I'm here now. There is a 2-part actual evaluation tool that is used by the committee in their evaluation. And then there's a multi-part rating system. And we're going to walk through each of those. So the 5-step cycle generally starts in a typical year with a self-assessment of the superintendent effectively within the superintendent's role as an administrator. That then leads to analysis, goal setting, and plan development, which is effectively what gets shared with the committee, what the committee would effectively vote in terms of the goals. There then is about implementation of the plan over the first part of the year. Part of the evaluation cycle is to have a formative assessment when about halfway through the year, the superintendent comes back and effectively has a conversation with the committee, not a formal presentation with all the gongs and whistles, just a conversation with the committee saying, here's the goals that you passed, that we agreed on, here's where we're at, And if there are questions, that's obviously a place for you to ask them. Also, if there are any adaptations that need to happen to the goals, this, by the way, was very important last year. If there's any adaptations that need to happen, that's the time to do it. And I always try to make sure that committees are aware of that, because there is this intended flexibility within the plan, such that, just to give one example that is not pandemic related, sometimes there are plans or programs that maybe the superintendent had planned to put into place that a grant didn't come through or something else happened. Rather than just have the superintendent fail on that goal for the year, there's an intent for there to be a check here that says, okay, so that didn't happen. What are we going to do as a governing body here? Are we going to try to continue to implement that? Are we going to change that to something else? How are we going to move forward for the rest of the year? So there really is this intent there for goals not to kind of inherently contain their own failure necessarily, and for there to really be that point in the session for the committee and the superintendent to have that check-in together. You then have effectively more implementation of the plan, not going backwards, but going forwards, until at the end of the year, there's a summative evaluation. And this is more what some of you may be familiar with, where the superintendent does a self-evaluation, presents that to the school committee, and the school committee then, everybody gets the same standard form, fills it out. Generally, it goes to the chair, who puts together a composite evaluation, which then is discussed in public session. Once it is agreed upon, it is actually voted as the formal evaluation of the school committee of the superintendent. So the first part of the evaluation tool, it involves the goals. And I think at this point, most of us who are involved in education have seen SMART goals a number of times. Sometimes we don't all agree on what the letters mean, but they seem to acquire multiple letters the longer we go. They do need to be specific. Test on that is, are you going to be able to tell that it happened? Right? Is there going to be an up or a down? Same thing with measurable. You do need to actually be able to show that it happened or not. Action-oriented, in that something is actually going to happen. Number of letters for R, rigorous, but also realistic and result-focused, and then timed and tracked. This can't just be a thing that's going to happen at some point, but there's actually going to be a time at which it will have happened. There should be within those goals, and how committees choose to put this together. Sometimes there are committees that choose to vote the key actions in the benchmarks. There are committees that choose to just see them when the superintendent has them. In some cases, the superintendent simply comes back to the committee with those. How you choose to do it is up to you. And then there do need to be goals within 3 areas. There needs to be a professional practice goal, there needs to be a student learning goal, there needs to be a district improvement goal. You can choose to have more than 3. We generally recommend that you not go more than 5. My colleague, Dorothy Presser, who does the District Governance Project, talks about having too many is like you're not having any. Sorry, she says that better than I do. But the point is that if you have too many goals, you end up going in too many directions, you diffuse your efforts, and you can't actually focus on this is what we're trying to get done. So then the second part of this is the standards and indicators of effective professional practice. This is standard to everyone, every superintendent who's being evaluated in Massachusetts. And those of you who are in education will recognize that there are parts of this that are reflective of the rest of the evaluation of other educators, right? So some of these are standard across. And they fall into 4 areas: instructional leadership, management and operations, family and community engagement, that's the one among that you will see all the way through to teaching, and professional culture. And every superintendent gets evaluated in all 4 of those areas. So how does this work? Within that structure of the rubric of professional practice, there are a number of standards that are effectively statements of what this looks like. Those then are sub-broken down into indicators, and those are sub-broken down into descriptors. Now that already sounds like it's overwhelming. Let me tell you about one of the changes that was made in the past 3 years. There used to be 4 breakdowns. So we've eliminated one of these. The intent was good, right? They want to make sure that you actually have a very sort of granular, concrete understanding of what this looks like. It did tend to kind of overwhelm, in particular, school committees, who, after all, are not actually doing this as part of their professional lives, right? Y'all are doing this as part of the volunteer service that you give to the community. And so there was an attempt to sort of back this up a little bit and keep it at a level that's more useful. So what does that look like? This, for example, is standard 1, which is instructional leadership, and 1A is about curriculum. The intent here is to actually you have a description of what it would look like to have exemplary practice in curriculum, proficient practice in curriculum, needs improvement practice, and unsatisfactory practice. So the descriptors here are intended to give you a picture that's somewhat concrete of what exactly that would look like. Now, this is true of every single one of the indicators that are within the rubric. In each case, so within the goals, you're going to grade within 5 different sections. You can either have exceeded a goal, have met a goal, have made significant progress on a goal, made some progress or not met it. And then when you're talking about the standards within those 4 sections, your performance can be exemplary, proficient, needs improvement, or unsatisfactory. And as I said, within the rubric, you have those descriptors saying that's what this looks like. And then overall, taking both of those sections, you then are going to give an overall summative rating of exemplary, proficient, needs improvement, or unsatisfactory. You each will do this as an individual member of the committee. Those then go together usually to the chair unless you appoint an evaluation chair. And that person then has the responsibility of creating a composite evaluation, which becomes the official evaluation of the superintendent. So when I'm giving committees pop quizzes on this, I say, how many evaluations of the superintendent are there? And the answer is that ultimately there is only one. Although each of your individual evaluations are actually a public document by virtue of being an evaluation of someone who works for a public body, just so you know. So again, this is review, right? It's a 5-step cycle. You have a 2-part tool, and then you have the multi-part rating system. So that sounds like a lot. How does it actually work? The first thing that should happen, and this, again, as I said, is why I'm glad we're having this conversation now. There does need to be some work with the superintendent on the superintendent's goals. That can happen a number of different ways. There are superintendents that bring goals back to the committee, that then there's a discussion together, the committee votes acceptance. Some places there's a subcommittee that works with the superintendent on that. Some cases the superintendent hands it off to a subcommittee who then comes back. The thing to remember is that, and this is true of every portion of the evaluation within Massachusetts education, it is the evaluator rather than the evaluatee that has the ultimate say in what the goals are. In other words, it is better if everybody's on the same page. If there is a disagreement, it ultimately becomes up to the school committee to decide. Thing that is a change. And this is actually probably the change that's the biggest for the committees that were trying to be extraordinarily faithful to the document before. You do have to evaluate within all 4 standards. However, you do not have to evaluate every indicator within the rubric. This is a massive change because of course, I think altogether there's something like 54 indicators. What should be done is deciding which of the indicators in a best case scenario, parallel the actual goals the superintendent has, in which case the 2 parts of the evaluation system are actually working together and supporting each other. Something you can do, we always offer this as an option. So far, this has been an option, I think, for all of the 10 years. So far, I believe I've heard of 1 committee doing it. You can decide on a weighing of standards. You can say this year we think that it's particularly important that the superintendent work on family and community engagement, and we're going to weigh that section of the evaluation more heavily. If you choose to do that, it just needs to be a general agreement ahead of time. It's not something you can decide in May. As I said, most people don't do that. You can. And again, as you're putting this together is really when you should have the conversation around, well, what's it going to look like for these goals to actually be implemented? How are we going to be able to find out that that happens? And this, again, is another reason why it's really important to have this conversation at the beginning of the year, and then effectively be faithful to it over the course of the year. Because too often, the committee then sort of tries to put things back together again in the spring. Whereas in best case scenario, what should be happening is that all of the reports that you receive from the superintendent and the administration over the course of the year should be linking back to the goals and should be part of the evaluation system in terms of the parts of the standard. So it may be that the superintendent is explicit and says during a presentation, you will notice that this is in support of the goal that I have on X. It could be that the committee itself keeps in mind what the goals are and what the particular parts of the rubric are that they're using for the indicators, and thinks about that as you go over the course of the year. But the main thing here is that you shouldn't do what I will confess I did the first year that I actually did an evaluation, and that was 2012, so in my defense, which is that we sat down with giant 3-ring binders and we went through all the evidence in June that we hadn't necessarily seen before. And obviously there was a lot of work the superintendent did that year too, all together at the end of the year. Instead, and this is really in many ways similar to what we say with students, right? You should be evaluating as you go along. This shouldn't be something that only happens at the end, because that's actually what should be happening. So you should be getting that information as you go. What do you need in order to put this together? You need to agree about goals, and you need to agree as to what it's going to look like if those goals are achieved. What are the outcomes going to be? How is the district going to be different if these goals are actually implemented? Agree on the applicable indicators within the rubric. Okay, you got to hit all 4 standards. You don't have to hit all the indicators. Which indicators actually support the goals? And again, and this is Dorothy Presser again, not too many, right? Don't pick 25. That doesn't actually help you that much more. You can certainly pick more than one within each standard. And again, make sure you hit all 4 standards. Is there going to be weighing of the standards? And if so, which? Part of the decision to make. And then discuss evidence. And I really think that this is something that I think that there are districts that are actually doing this really well. In some cases, they're doing it, honestly, just some of the conversation you just were having in terms of what's the timeline of when things are going to be presented to us to make you as a committee most effective and helpful to the work of the administration. Those kind of conversations are actually, first of all, it's a best practice, so good job. But secondly, that's actually helpful also in terms of your thinking which of those pieces of evidence might be part of the superintendent's evaluation. How is that evidence of work towards the goal? And by that I mean not that you're judging the superintendent based on last year's MCAS scores, because that's not particularly useful, but what is the work that's being done as a result of that, and how is that work potentially towards a goal? And that's just for example. But that's the kind of thing to have a conversation about as you're putting the goals together. And then again, creating a year-long agenda. And that does not have to be, we have, here's the whole list of meetings and we know exactly what we're doing every week. If anything else, the last 18 months have taught us the possible, not uselessness of such planning in some cases. But as you said, we know when the MCAS scores come out. We know when we have to have the first round of the budget conversation. We know there are particular things that we know by virtue of how the calendar works. And that also then gives you some places to plug in when exactly you're going to be having particular kinds of conversations that, again, relate directly back to those goals. So what's required? You got to have 4 SMART goals in 3 areas, okay? So obviously in one of them you're going to have 2. You can have more. We tell you not to have too many more. You do have to have ratings in all 4 of the standards, and you do have to have an overall summative rating at the end. Things that are optional. Do not have to use all the indicators. You can choose to weigh the 4 standards differently. When exactly you do this is actually entirely up to you. It just has to happen. I think there are some committees that have it in their head that there's a particular time by which something is due or something has to happen. You just have to have done it. How exactly the evaluation is used? First of all, there are committees that have it written into the contract with the superintendent that this has particular kinds of impacts. But something else to have a conversation about is, among other things, what then is the cycle moving forward? Because remember, it is a circle. So your evaluation should kick off another self-assessment with new goal setting. Much in the way that sometimes we all take a breath after the budget passed, I feel like there sometimes are committees that sort of take a breath after evaluation, and you want to make sure you don't leave it too long so that people have forgotten the conversation. And then also, you as a committee need to decide in your process. When do people get when is there a self-evaluation? When do people get the document? When are they due to whoever has to do the compilation? Who's doing the compilation? How are they doing the compilation? And then when effectively does it become public? So in terms of the timing of the cycle, we just try to mention this. What are some of the things you need to consider? First of all, I think it's wise to acknowledge that we do, by virtue of being school committees, operate on a school calendar, right? However, and in some cases somewhat awkwardly, we also have elections at various times during the year, which don't really at all jive with anything else we do. Obviously, that has considerations in terms of who is it that's actually evaluating the superintendent. Any time that there is going to potentially be turnover on the school committee, having some conversation about who it actually is that evaluates the superintendent, particularly, I will say, for town elections followed by spring evaluations, because that's really the hard one. Do people who have been on the committee but are leaving the committee submit something to the chair before they go? What do new members do? Usually you need to, hopefully you can have that conversation in a sort of graceful way. Sometimes there are contentious political elections and then it ends up being very heated. So this conversation around, at what length of service does it require and what kind of input do they give? The one thing to remember about newly elected members is that you can only evaluate based on what you saw as a member, not based on what you saw as a parent, community member, whatever. And then ultimately who actually votes. And I will say that there are actually even committees that have written that into their bylaws. There are regional committees that have written into their regional agreements. Depending on how difficult this is, that can be something to consider. So in terms of the step-by-step, committee members complete the individual evaluations. This can be everybody gets a packet of paper. This can be here's the form online. Main thing to remember is don't violate the open meeting law, so don't have one document that everyone can see. You do need to have some, some way of the evidence of progress and proficiency getting to you. So is that old school with a 3-ring binder? Is that you've got all of the backups for the presentations that you've received over the course of the year and those are somehow keyed to the goals of the superintendent? That'd be fantastic. Are those, collected in a folder somewhere online? And then ultimately you of course need to form to complete the evaluation. So those individual evaluations then go to whoever is completing the composite evaluation. There does need to be a process for that. There are committees that choose to do this in subcommittee. The thing that sometimes they forget is that by virtue of this being about the evaluation of the superintendent, that subcommittee has to meet in public, which sometimes takes away the whole reason for having a subcommittee do it. So keep that in mind. And then that composite evaluation comes back to the full committee. It is discussed at a full committee meeting and ultimately is voted on by the committee as effectively you're approving it. If you need to make changes on it as a committee, you can do that. Do keep in mind the new SJC ruling does say effectively that everybody gets it all at once. It's a public document as soon as the committee has it. So there can't be a thing where the committee has it and then nobody else gets it until later. It's you make a decision as to who gets it when, because everybody has to get it all together. So we won't argue with the SJC. Keep in mind, if you are the creator of the composite, it is a single document, but it does need to in some way be a document in which everyone can actually hear their own voice. It is important to not dismiss or get rid of, say, minority voices that might be expressing particular kinds of opinions. The other thing that we think is important to note is that there's always a temptation when we're grading to start averaging numbers and having that be it. What you want, rather than just an average, is you want to make sure that it actually is representing, again, that composite voice. So you want that the numbers that you're giving, or effectively the grade that you're giving, to actually agree with this composite creation of comments that you've made. So I think that sometimes is potentially the most difficult part of this. I've seen some committees have these very sophisticated spreadsheets that they've worked out where like the numbers were all going to be pre-calculated, and we said it has to be a little bit more of a human process than that, to make sure that it's actually reflecting the voice. And really how comments are handled is an important, I think is probably the most complicated part of this, more so honestly even than giving the ratings, in terms of what needs to be included, what can be left out, and how you balance out, again, effectively the voices. So keep that in mind as you're considering who is it that's going to put the composite together. Your goals should be specific to the individual and to your district. You should be considering progress made on action items within the goals. And something that's really a best practice, particularly as the school committee member who's actually writing the evaluation, refer to the evidence. Like, how do you know this? Where did this come from? Where are you getting this idea? That's actually, it makes for a stronger evaluation. It also obviously makes it much more useful to the superintendent, since that's supposed to be the point here. This is right from how DESE describes the standards. They're intended to establish a statewide understanding about what effective leadership and teaching practice looks like. They're supposed to be a common understanding that we have in Massachusetts of what we hold as excellent practice. Just to go through the 4 levels here, and I think this is kind of maybe the trickiest part as a school committee member. Partly because we don't tend to evaluate people in public, right? Just about everybody who works, they have their evaluations in private. Superintendents are probably the most public evaluation that any of us ever see. And I think that tends to put some onus on the school committee in ways that are both appropriate and inappropriate in terms of how they balance things out. So the thing that's, I think, most important to understand is that proficient is fully satisfactory. It means that the superintendent is entirely doing the superintendent's job. And because this is Massachusetts, that's actually a high standard. That's a rigorous standard. That's not like you're sliding by with a gentleman's C. This is demanding but attainable. It's something that is actually an excellent kind of practice, but that can also be achieved. In other words, if you're giving someone a proficient rating, you're not giving them a bad rating. And I think that sometimes people put that in their mind as if it's, you're giving a B or you're giving the second rating down. That is not actually at all the intent. And the reason I say that is because exemplary is actually supposed to be very rarely given. And I don't always see this in terms of school committees. It's intended to be, this is someone who could actually show other people how to do this, whatever this is. This is someone that we would put up on a stage and point to as someone who does this so well that anyone in the state could come look at how they do this and they would learn things. It's really not supposed to be something that is given all the time. And if a superintendent doesn't get exemplary ratings, that doesn't mean that they're doing a bad job at all, in any way at all. Now, in terms of needs improvement, it's phrased this way intentionally. And again, I think this is a hard one sometimes for committee members to give, but the idea here is that you wouldn't say that you needed improvement if you didn't think that improvement was possible. So the intent here is and the one thing I will say both on this and on the next standard is make sure that you're tying it into the evidence. If you have a reason to give needs improvement or unsatisfactory, make sure you can demonstrate exactly how that is. Now, I would argue, and partly this is just the former English teacher in me, you should always be able to defend whatever it is that you're saying, right? You should always be referring to your evidence. But it's particularly important in these cases, and the reason is you are trying to give this evaluation so that someone can get better, and they can only do that if they know where it is that the holes are. Unsatisfactory usually is the second round, right? You've had a goal, or you're talking about instructional leadership, you're talking about one of the standards, and you've already given a needs improvement, and the improvement didn't happen. Or the performance as you go through the standards is always well below the requirements of the standard, consistently. or both of those things are true. So things to keep in mind, you do need to have the evidence that's been given to you, as well as whatever self-assessments you've been doing over the course of the year, whatever you've observed. You do want to keep it to the time frame. In other words, don't evaluate outside the cycle. And again, tie the ratings and comments to the evidence and the observations that you've made. The department does have resources online. They even put together a little video series where they talked to superintendents and school committee members in each of these sections. So as you're trying to learn things, that's another thing that's available to you. And also, of course, you can find the rubrics online. And I have just talked a lot. And I didn't have you stop me, which I should have said at the beginning, that if you wanted to stop me at any point, you can. But we can go back to anything you have questions on or that you want to talk more about.
I have a bunch of questions.
All right. Let's talk about your
Everybody's
questions.
waiting for me to get started with all my questions. Should it be on a 12-month cycle, essentially?
If you keep in mind sort of all of it, right?
Yeah.
So there's going to be a space between your evaluation and the next round of goal setting,
Yeah.
where you actually sort of do that process of everyone says, okay, that was the evaluation. Now what are we going to do next?
Yeah.
So yes, in some way, but that doesn't mean that doesn't mean it's January to December. It also doesn't necessarily mean that it's July to June either.
Okay. If we were to agree as a committee that members, like, turnover is part of my concern.
Yes.
And the timeline, like you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Because when we get new members is not the end of the school year, which seems,
Yes.
To be a sensible time to do an evaluation. So if, let's say, if as a committee we were to decide you have to have been on the school committee for X number of months to perform an evaluation, when it actually goes to the voting on the final document, can we disallow people who haven't?
You can't.
You cannot.
No, but that's one where, and again, there's so much, I don't know if you all find this, there's so much of committee work that actually depends on the integrity of the individuals, right? This is really one where you would hope that either the person would simply vote in favor because it was the, informed opinion of their peers, or they would simply recuse themselves. I would also say that someone who is new on the committee, if you're talking about someone who's done, say, 2 months, 3 months, may have a comment or two to make during the evaluation based on what they've said,
Yeah.
though they won't be doing the full evaluation. And I would hope that that would, be welcomed effectively by the rest of the committee.
Okay. Now this is a more cerebral question. So for some types of goals, I can imagine how it would be pretty concrete and easy to sort of measure. So let's say a goal is I want to apply for XYZ grants because I want to expand XYZ programs, and we're able to really see that and measure it and track it. Now, the thing that is complicated about this to me is when we talk about a teacher evaluation and administrator evaluation, those people work together in their jobs.
Right.
We only interact in the school capacity here.
Right.
And the information is presented to us by the person that we are evaluating. So what is, say for family outreach, what are we supposed to be basing that on besides, let's say we can see these steps were taken, but if it wasn't effective on the family side, are we supposed to be seeking input from the community, from different stakeholders, from teachers, from things like that? Are we supposed to be seeking it? If it is offered up to us, are we supposed to take it? That's sort of where I'm a little lost because we don't see
Sure.
the boots on the ground.
Right. So that's part of why the department kind of backed up a little bit in terms of the indicators and so forth to try to get it back up to the school committee level. I'd say a couple of things. The first is that it is actually always up to the evaluated to have the evidence that they're presenting to the evaluator. So that's true of teachers too. They're the ones who are supposed to be putting it together. Now, as you note, there's still a distinction because the principal is going to come into the classroom and see the teacher actually doing the teaching part, right? You don't see all of the superintending in the same way.
Right.
However, in terms of, so there's going to be evidence that certainly is simply going to be the superintendent saying, here are the family newsletters, here are the Connect Eds, here are the programs we had, those kinds of things. If there is a goal in which you feel it would be effective to have some sort of other voice involved, whether that's you want to have the family's voices involved or you want to have the staff voices involved, best practice is to have an agreement at the beginning as part of that conversation around what are the evidence we're going to use, that we would like to have, a survey, a comment card, a something. The concern always is, how do you make sure that you're realizing that only some people ever answer those? And in many cases, they happen to be the people who are perhaps least happy.
Right.
So that's always the thing that everyone needs to balance in that conversation. I will say that I get questions around surveys and superintendent evaluation multiple times a year. I know of very, very few committees that end up going forward with it for exactly that reason. Because nobody knows better than, and particularly this year, nobody knows better than the school committee that it tends to be the unhappiest people who are the loudest, right? So that's something you want to make sure that you're not unduly subjecting your superintendent to when you're actually doing the evaluation. So I think that I think that's something that every committee member should always say is, we're evaluating the superintendent, here are the goals. If there's anything you think I should know, I'm always happy to hear from people, but I think that you put that in the same context that you do, honestly, anything that you ever hear from any of your constituencies. And again, always put it in terms of the relative level of how important that is. Yep. That's a good question. I'm glad you asked it now, because that way I'm not fielding a question from you about surveys in May.
No, I had that same question too. What's the collection of data that we're going to get over the year? So we have the school committee minutes, we have, our own discussions and things about how things are going. But if we're evaluating it like one time in the year,
Yep.
how do we have all of that at our
So,
fingertips,
well, I'm hoping that it's not going to be 3 giant binders like what I had my first year, right? There certainly are committees in which someone's actually keeping, a Google folder or something like that actually has, those reports, the minutes, the whatever. And I do think that it's good for you all to have that conversation about each of the goals of what are we going to see over the course of the year that's going to actually give us the evidence we need to do an evaluation on this particular goal. I know that, and then of course you've got some that are potentially kind of obvious, right? So one of the operations and management questions is about budget. Well, your budget itself is, obviously a piece of evidence for that. There's a number of them that sort of you're going to use particular documents regardless of who you are as a committee. But I do think that that's definitely a conversation to have up front of, as you talk about each of the goals and each of the indicators that you might be relating to those goals, what is it that you're going to be planning on using in order to figure out at the end where you are?
So it sounds like there's a lot of conversation or a lot of planning of the year that happens up front in those initial conversations.
You may have just said the most important thing that anyone said tonight. Absolutely. Yes. Yes. If you are doing this correctly, there's a big conversation and maybe several conversations that have to happen at the beginning. Yes. There is potentially just as much, if not more work at the beginning than there is at the end. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Hold on to that thought.
When agreeing on goals, do committees ever reach out to teachers' associations, to admin, or is it strictly between the superintendent and the school committee?
So if you remember from roles and responsibilities, not to give you a quiz, but the way that the relationship between the superintendent and the school committee is supposed to work is that the school committee should be the bridge between the administration and the community, and the superintendent should be the bridge between the staff and the school committee. So if there are things that the staff may need in the evaluation, the best practice is for that to be coming from the superintendent. Okay. If there are things that the community needs in the evaluation of, we've got a whole bunch of families who say that they never hear from anyone.
Right.
Clearly a family, a community engagement kind of thing. Those sorts of things, that can come in from the other side. The other thing, by the way, that I should say is, this isn't in the presentation, but it's sort of always a temptation of committees. Make sure that you're setting goals for the superintendent that are actually under the superintendent's purview. Yeah. that are ones that are under your purview. And contrary-wise, if you choose to set school committee goals, make sure they're not a way of just stacking other goals onto the superintendent, but are actually things that you as a school committee can do. Oh, wow.
Oh, boy, I know.
That's very exciting.
No, that's helpful. I think it's just important to me that we are finding the balance. Like, obviously, the point of this is not to do micromanaging. That's not what our
Yes.
position is. So I don't want us to slip into that.
And I will say, we all have had our mixed experiences with the department this year. But one thing that was actually really encouraging to us at the association is that we kept saying to them, the rubric that you've given us is making it really difficult for the committee to evaluate the superintendent based on what the committee actually sees. They had this idea in their head, and you can actually see this because they have, the same rubric for superintendents and principals and business managers and, everybody. And meanwhile, they're saying exactly what you all are, which is, it's not like we follow the superintendent around all day. Like, we see the superintendent at school committee meetings and maybe out at public events, but that's not most of what the superintendent does. And they actually did take that into consideration, which is why they backed it up to rubric, to the indicator level. And then again, tried to have this relationship between the goals and the indicators on which you're evaluating.
Thank you.
Is there typically a liaison on the staff level?
I mean, aside from, I'm sure that you have a secretary who passes a lot of paper your way, right? Or the equivalent. Aside from that, not usually, no.
So that secretary is typically a data collector from that.
Well, I mean, it's up to the superintendent, really, of who is it that's, or I mean, it can be a conversation the superintendent has with the chair of who's actually collecting the information that the committee is going to use for the evaluation.
Okay, just so that staff feels comfortable submitting.
Well, if there's any information that is going to go into go in as evidence, that should be coming from the superintendent to you. Because it's the responsibility of the evaluated person to be submitting the evidence to the evaluator or evaluators.
So I'll ask the question that nobody else wants to ask.
That's why they put you in, made you chair, Heather.
So we did do goals at the beginning of last year. We did establish goals. I don't believe that we voted on, we did vote on the goals that you had.
I don't recall if we voted or not voted on them. We could go back and check the minutes.
We have to
but I
go
don't-
check into it. So we did have goals.
Yep.
Vera came back to us middle of the year, gave us a progress report.
Good.
And then at the end of the year,
Yep.
we did a progress report.
Okay.
So, what's the corrective action plan we as a committee need to do? Because obviously, we want to make sure we do an evaluation because that's the only way we can have growth.
Yes.
So, so that's what we're looking for you to advise us what we should be doing.
So the first thing is, by the way, you all should know, by the way, that I have talked about all of you to other committees because people have said things like, well, how can you possibly appoint a superintendent if everybody is isolated? And I said, well, I don't know, go talk to Douglas because they did it and it seems to actually be working. So, you've done some things that were actually really complicated in the last year, and that's true of all of us, but it's particularly true of you all because you also were establishing a relationship together, in some cases without actually ever seeing each other. So, well done, all right? Like, no one's going to give you a score on that. I'm going to tell you up front, you all did a good job there. Good job. Yes, and you are also not the only committee superintendent, relationship where everyone said, wait, what are we doing about evaluation, right? It sounds as if there were a number of attempts that were made to try to at least keep the process moving forward. What I would suggest, given where you're at, is that you take whatever sort of the conversation was around the sort of final presentation, that you as a committee, if you as a committee had that conversation and gave feedback to the superintendent, I think the first conversation is, are you in a situation to feel like you can come back with proposed goals to the school committee? You may not be. The committee may feel like they need to have another conversation about that. That would be my initial thing, is to say, where are you with establishing goals for this year? Once you've had that conversation, then you can start to sort of, get some solid ground under you of, okay, so then what does the evaluation cycle look like? How does that interact with the elections? What does it mean that we still have, pandemic kinds of limitations? And again, how do the goals relate to the standards and the indicators? What are we going to select from there? So yeah, so I mean, you're not starting from zero. And I think that probably this starts with a conversation, which it's clear to me that you all have a relationship where you can have that conversation, which again is a good place to be starting from. Assuming we don't all.
I hope everyone brought oars.
What other questions do you have? Do you feel like this puts you in a good position? I guess I should say.
It does. I mean, the evaluation, we've had the discussion as a leadership team about the importance of evaluating staff for that feedback, for growth, for reflection.
Yes.
So obviously, the same process has to work from the school committee to me and from me to administrators. So this is perfect. I wish I had heard the 3 to 5 goals, because I think I did 7 last year. So.
Really, that's something we should, yes, we should not only tell school committees that, we really should tell particularly new superintendents that, because
So-
they're like, yes, we're gonna go do this.
So-
Like,
Anyone.
So I did 7 last year. We already started the process this year. Last year, we created a blueprint for continuous student improvement, which is our strategic plan. We met as a leadership team. Monique was part of that this year too. And we started putting together a strategic plan for this school year. Principals are going to meet with staff. They're going to meet with their school, with their, why can't I remember the word? School councils, thank you very much. We're gonna, Mrs. Charniak said, survey the community, we're gonna get some feedback from the community. So at the beginning of October, we're gonna have our strategic plan in place. So a lot of my goals and administrative goals will come from that blueprint, which came from us working with staff, us working with community members, us working with kids, us surveying the community again, then principals going back out and getting that input from staff. So that's where our blueprint will come from, and our goals will come based off of that blueprint. So that's where I'm at right now, which will probably happen early to mid-October, because we're in day 3.
You actually have to do the whole, right,
We have to
starting
go through the
school
process.
thing, right? Yes.
Yeah.
So, and regarding those goals, is it okay or good that, like, if we have those, 3 goals that we are evaluating on, but he has personal goals that he wants to, I mean, like, if he has the bandwidth to do 7 things, like, I don't want to stop him, so.
I don't know if I have bandwidth to do 7.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody's
So
at the
there's a couple of things that are not officially part of the job of the school committee that I always tell school committee members they should do. Like, one of them is you should always be the ones who question whether or not there's enough staff in the business office, because nobody who does finance is ever going to tell you that they need more staff, right? Another thing that I always say is it is actually part of your job to try to preserve some of the sanity of the superintendent to whatever extent possible. And that may mean, like that you have all the support in the
down on your
world,
goals.
you have an excellent superintendent.
Yes.
But, sorry,
3 to
we're
5.
talking about the business office? Included that on purpose.
Yes.
But that you're dealing with a pandemic, you're bringing students back.
Yeah.
There's the thing that I always say to school committee members is that
That's the goal.
you are evaluating based on that. The whole rest of the standards, the superintendent still has to do.
Yeah.
You're not giving a grade on that, but the whole, are they following the laws? Are they following the ethics? Do they have a schedule that works? That's in the indicators.
Right.
You may not give them a grade on it. They still actually have to do it all.
Yeah.
As well as the 25 pages that DESE has on their website of what every superintendent has to do, right? The checklist. So it can be, if you have that relationship with the superintendent, which I'm inferring that you do, that can be a healthy thing for the school committee to say, which is, we think we applaud your enthusiasm and your energy. We also want to make sure that you still have enthusiasm and energy, not just at the end of this year, but for years to come.
Right.
How do we put this together in a way that means that you are going to be able to, still be here at the end of the year, that we're going to get done what we need to? Also, the other thing is, and this is different depending on the size of the district, how much of it is actually the work of the superintendent and how much of it is the work of other administrators? Because one of the things that school committees sometimes run into is, the superintendent said that, one of the things the superintendent wants to be evaluated on is the budget document. But we know the superintendent doesn't put together the budget document, except maybe they do. How do you evaluate the superintendent based on that? So that conversation too of, is this sort of an administration goal rather than an actual individual superintendent goal? And both of those are fine, because ultimately the superintendent is the chief executive of the district, is ultimately responsible for all of the administration of the district. But that can be, in terms of the level of energy question, that can be a healthy way of weighing that too. Does that help a bit? Okay.
Now, going back to Heather's question, and given this past year being so unusual, and I expect this upcoming year to continue to be unusual, would it be improper of us to kind of start from scratch here, where we're looking at the goals again now and putting off the formal evaluation until the spring? Is that
So I'm not going to tell you to try to evaluate based on last year's goals now.
right?
I'm going to say it sounds like you had sort of an informal conversation, and you skipped the documentation. And if Desi comes looking for you, you as a committee are going to say mea culpa. We blew it. The superintendent was on top of things. We didn't make it work. No one's going to take away your anything this past year because of that. I'm going to tell you that up front. You also are not the only committee that didn't have a written evaluation of the superintendent this past year.
Yep.
There were some committees that thought it was actually completely waived for some reason. So I would not fret about that.
Yep.
I would make sure that you all have given whatever feedback is necessary to inform what sounds like is a lot of work that's already been happening at the administration.
Yeah.
To make sure that, effectively that report's not going to come out in October and you all are going to go, what? Right? You want to make sure that this is actually part of something that is on a continuum of things that you were already expecting.
Yeah.
Now, my sense is that clearly administration has been informed by your conversations. But I would just make sure that if there was anything that you sort of flagged coming out of last year, that's feedback that's already gone to the superintendent.
I think we did provide feedback when you came at the end of the year, we did provide feedback on where we thought the community, the
Yeah.
social emotional well-being of kids and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I
I
feel
was going to say, some of the conversations that you already were having earlier this evening made it clear that there were sort of like things that happened last year, that there was work on that happened over the summer that are informing what happens here, which, I mean, that's actually how goals are supposed to work, right? So,
Yeah, I think
there's stuff happening in action right now.
Yeah, I think my point is just that I don't want to see us rush it to kind of say, okay, like let's just get this done as soon as we can. I'd rather be able to see us like set up a model that, we have 3-year terms, but still a decent amount of turnover.
Yeah.
And I think it's difficult it would be nice if we could set up a pattern that's sort of predictable, where it's like, this is the format, so new people coming in can be trained in it and do it right.
Right. And so it could well be, I mean, I will say that I wouldn't lock yourselves into a calendar this year in terms of we're always going to have the goals set,
Right.
coming to us in October.
Right.
It may well be that isn't exactly where in the calendar it needs to lie.
Right.
I will say that, again, with that sort of sensitivity to what else is going on, you don't want to be having this conversation at this meeting,
Yeah.
right? You want to be doing goal setting when you're getting the opening of school report. Then adjusting the sort of mid-cycle portion of the review accordingly, and adjusting when exactly the evaluation is accordingly.
Is it reasonable, so they had mentioned, so I'm the newest committee member here, but they had mentioned that they did, mid-year, performance, and then they did an end of the year. Is that a typical process?
Yes.
Okay.
And just keep in mind, the mid-year is really generally more of a conversation. It's not, here is the rubric, here are my checkoff boxes and so forth, either for the superintendent or for the committee. It's really more the superintendent saying, so here, you'll remember that these are the goals and these are the indicators. Here's a bunch of the work that we've been doing, which should be, as you know. And here are, some things I want to make sure I point out to you, some adjustments that maybe need to be made. And that's a time for you all to also then have a conversation around, are we where we need to be? Are there things that need to be changed? That sort of thing.
we have some work to do, ladies.
But it sounds as if there's also been a lot of work that's actually sort of already
yes.
going on.
Yes,
that will
yes.
inform that. That's a helpful thing.
Yes.
You are very much not starting from scratch.
Yes. So,
All right.
any other questions from
I'm
anybody
good, thank you, it
else
was a great
to Tracy?
presentation.
Thank you very
Great. So what I will do is I will send this to you so that you
Yes.
can sort of go back, because I know that, again, it's a lot, it's sort
Yeah.
of a wall of words and a lot of that kind of thing. And that way, both now and then also when you get to the evaluation, I will say that the sort of pieces and parts of it make more sense when you're sort of sitting with, if you have that and you're sitting in front of the rubric, the parts do make more sense that way. Great. All right, I'm going to go grab the end of my clicker, so don't forget.
Thank
That's
you.
always the danger.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Tracy.
you so much.
Oh, thank you.
And we're moving on to the accounts payable report.
On warrant 09 SCH22, warrant date 8/26/2021, batch number 387 to 391. The total amount was $61,178.57, which was signed and approved.
Thank you, Julie. Now moving on to the consent agenda. We've got to review the August 24th meeting minutes.
So I actually saw on page 2, very beginning of page 2, that was me that asked about the kids at circle time and not Miss Moran. One edit.
I'll make that edit.
Typo here, okay. Get that to her.
So do you want to hold on approving these?
No, we
or-
can do it as amended.
If nobody else notices anything, I'll be looking for a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve the school committee meeting minutes for August 24th, 2021 as amended.
Looking for a second.
Second.
Second by Becky. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, thank you. Next is the DHS out-of-state athletic contest. Mr. Romano is going to come talk to us.
Hello, so every year I come a few times to ask for permission to have the teams go out of state, usually to Rhode Island or Northern Connecticut. And I know that we have 2 events coming up. One is a track meet that we do annually in Rhode Island, and another is a golf match that's going to be sometime later in September. And so this year I thought I would maybe get ahead of it and maybe be more efficient, and just ask for kind of a blanket permission to do out-of-state contests for our athletic teams. I was going to give you the exact number of our scheduled contests that are taking place out of state, but all of the MIA scheduling sites, they don't list our games right now, so I don't know what's up with that, and Ms. Sokol's away right now. So I know it's at least the 2. I just thought maybe it'd be more efficient to just maybe get a blanket permission for the fall sports.
Any discussion for Mr. Romano? I have no issues, I mean.
You're not taking them to California?
If we qualify for nationals and they're in California and you guys are cool with it, I'm cool with it too. But no, there's no plans for that right now. What it comes down to is, we are at the mercy kind of golf courses, and when they make themselves available to students, they make a lot more money by being available for adult golfers than for high school students, so we kind of have to take the space that we can get.
I think the only thing that I think of is, any COVID things that come up from state to state. I'm not sure, I don't believe there's anything for outdoor sports in the neighboring states anyway, but, that's just one thing that.
So we could readdress it when it comes down to winter sports too. If you want to just do fall sports, we can do that.
I would think that even if we pass it as is, if there's a restriction where, Massachusetts residents are not allowed in Rhode Island, they wouldn't be able to continue with the,
Yeah.
we're not going to be able to.
Yeah, the event would probably be canceled, so.
Right.
But we would be just making sure we're aware of what their COVID, if we're not wearing masks here, but they're wearing masks in another state that we're traveling to, that they.
Yeah, I think we would still have to fall under the rules for Massachusetts if we went into another state. There's still Massachusetts students, they would still have to fall under the MIA probably. So, which right now is requiring masks.
How far do you think that, is it just the neighboring states, like Connecticut, Mass?
Yeah, this is just the Connecticut and Rhode Island, the places that we normally go. Tallinn, Connecticut's one, and then I can't remember where the track meet that we do in Rhode Island is.
Ocean State?
Ocean State, thank you.
It's like an
Yeah, but I
hour.
can't remember where exactly it is.
Thompson's actually closer than Sutton, the Sutton golf course, so it's
It's literally right over the line.
Yeah.
It's the same old,
Yeah,
same old.
well,
If they're
even to
taking
school.
a big trip, they're gonna come back and talk to us.
Yeah, and this is just our athletic trips.
So, I'll make a motion. So I move to approve a permission for the athletics program at Douglas High School to participate in regularly scheduled matches and games held out of state for the 2021-22 school year.
Second?
Motion made by Julie, second by Lisa. All those in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, thank you so much.
I am determined to knock this thing down.
You are.
Thank you very much, I appreciate it.
Thank
And I'll
you
see you
for
in 2
saying-
weeks anyway.
Perfect.
Okay, and so we're going to hold the vote on the date to close school choice until the 15th.
Correct.
If I heard that correctly, so we're going to move that. So now we're going to move on to the school business and operations report from Ms. Courtney. Thank you.
I don't have any transfers and reclassifications this evening, but I do want to say that, and to echo what Dr. Vieira said about the beginning of the school year, I mean, busing, you remember last year, even with busing was, oh my goodness, cohort A and cohort B and all of the things. And I want to just kind of reiterate again that it's really great when you have vendors that, know our town, the bus drivers have been there for years, they know the kids, and, so a couple little things here and there, but things went very well. And I really appreciate all of their efforts with regard to that. School lunch as well, a lot of changes, huge changes from last year to this year. So, and everything just went off without, with no issues at all. So we're really, really happy with that.
Yeah, how nice is it to hear a teenager say the food is good?
I know, huh?
Pretty impressive.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah, so I'm very happy with how things are going and everything under my area, so. And as well with the, getting all the buildings ready and everything too. So as far as cleaning and moving things and everything that we talked about before, so very happy, like Dr. Vera said, with how everything has gone with the first few days.
And I'll just piggyback off on one thing that it was great to see. We've been in school for 3 days, and we had a transfer student already rise to the level that Mrs. Hayes recognized her, knew her, had a conversation with her, said, you'd be great to come out and do this. And we're 2 days with kids into the school year, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, that is, really is.
Nothing else, Courtney?
All set, thank you.
All right. Any topics that we did not anticipate this evening? Do we need to do an executive session
We
at
do
all?
not.
Awesome. So I'd be looking to adjourn the school committee with a roll call vote, right? Oh,
No.
wait, am I wrong?
If it's just on Zoom,
It is
confusing.
8:21.
8:21 to close out the school committee meeting at 8:21 on September 1st.
So moved.